I observe the convergence of imperial desperation and nuclear brinkmanship, as Trump's admission of considering military strikes against Iran marks the definitive moment when American hegemonic decline transforms from gradual erosion into accelerated collapse through strategic overreach that regional powers cannot contain. This represents far more than standard Middle Eastern crisis management. We witness the systematic breakdown of deterrence architecture that has prevented global warfare since 1945, triggered by an American administration whose domestic political vulnerabilities demand foreign military diversion, regardless of systemic consequences. The strategic timing reveals calculated exploitation of perceived Iranian weakness following months of protest suppression and economic pressure, combined with Trump's Supreme Court defeat over tariff implementation that creates domestic political imperative for overseas military action. When American presidents face constitutional constraints on domestic authority, historical pattern demonstrates consistent pivot toward foreign military intervention that restores executive power through commander-in-chief prerogatives that congressional opposition cannot effectively challenge. The military positioning proves more comprehensive than any previous American deployment against Iran, with USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group already operational in Persian Gulf waters, while USS Gerald Ford approaches from Atlantic Corridor, creating combined naval aviation capacity, exceeding 150 aircraft within striking distance of Iranian territory. This deployment scale indicates operational preparation beyond diplomatic pressure towards sustained bombing campaign capability that suggests regime change rather than limited nuclear facility targeting. Iranian defensive preparations demonstrate strategic sophistication that American intelligence consistently underestimates, with satellite imagery revealing concrete fortification and underground facility expansion that complicates surgical strike scenarios. American planners prefer. Revolutionary Guard dispersal of critical assets across multiple hardened sites ensures that effective military action requires prolonged campaign rather than single strike solutions, creating commitment levels that American domestic political system cannot sustain through inevitable casualties and regional complications. The negotiation theater operating parallel to military buildup reveals sophisticated psychological warfare designed to create Iranian strategic confusion while maximizing American operational flexibility. When Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi announces potential deal completion within days while Trump simultaneously confirms strike consideration, we observe deliberate creation of cognitive dissonance that prevents effective Iranian strategic planning and international diplomatic intervention. Regional alliance calculations proved decisive for operational success probability, as Saudi Arabia and UAE refuse airspace access while Qatar evacuates American personnel from Al Udeid Air Base, creating operational constraints that force American reliance on carrier-based aviation and extended-range bomber operations from distant bases. This limitation significantly reduces sortie generation capacity while increasing operational costs and complexity that military effectiveness requires for decisive outcomes. Israeli coordination remains deliberately ambiguous to maintain American operational independence while preserving plausible deniability for regional allies who fear Iranian retaliation exceeding their defensive capabilities. Netanyahu's strategic calculation involves maximizing American military commitment against Iran while minimizing Israeli visibility that would trigger comprehensive regional warfare involving multiple state actors simultaneously. Oil market dynamics reveal global economic vulnerability to Middle Eastern warfare escalation, with Brent crude approaching $72 per barrel representing only initial price discovery before potential Strait of Hormuz disruption that could eliminate 31% of global seaborne crude flows within hours. Market psychology indicates trader preparation for prolonged supply disruption rather than temporary strategic strike scenario, suggesting informed assessment of escalation probability exceeding public diplomatic statements. Chinese strategic positioning demonstrates careful preparation for American imperial overextension opportunity, with Beijing avoiding direct Iranian support, while positioning for post-conflict regional influence expansion through economic reconstruction partnerships and technological cooperation agreements. Every American military resource committed to Iranian operations represents reduced capacity for Pacific theater deterrence, creating windows for Chinese advancement that strategic planners cannot ignore. Russian involvement through joint naval exercises with Iran provides sophisticated intelligence sharing and defensive capability enhancement that complicates American operational planning, while avoiding direct confrontation triggers that would justify NATO response. Moscow's calculation involves bleeding American military resources through proxy support, while maintaining strategic ambiguity about retaliation assistance levels. The domestic American political context creates additional pressure for military action beyond strategic necessity, as Trump faces congressional opposition over tariff authority and requires foreign policy success to restore executive credibility before midterm electoral cycle. Historical pattern demonstrates American presidential tendency to initiate foreign military action when domestic political authority faces constitutional challenge through legislative or judicial constraint. Internal administration divisions reveal strategic incoherence that increases escalation probability through institutional confusion rather than calculated policy implementation. When Vice President Vance opposes military action while son-in-law Kushner manages diplomatic channels, policy execution becomes reactive improvisation rather than systematic strategic planning that crisis management requires for controlled escalation. Nuclear proliferation implications extend beyond immediate Iranian program concerns into systemic incentive structures that regional powers evaluate for independent deterrent capability development. Saudi Arabia's Pakistani nuclear cooperation accelerates when Iranian nuclear status faces American military action without providing corresponding security guarantees for regional allies faces Iranian proxy retaliation capacity. European strategic orphanage created by American alliance management failures means continental capitals cannot effectively coordinate diplomatic intervention, while simultaneously depending on American security guarantees for protection against Russian pressure. European energy security depends on Middle Eastern stability that American military action threatens without providing alternative supply arrangements or crisis management mechanisms. The asymmetric warfare dimension proves crucial for understanding Iranian retaliation capacity beyond conventional military response scenarios. Revolutionary Guard cyber capabilities targeting American financial infrastructure provide retaliation options that impose systemic costs while avoiding nuclear escalation thresholds that would justify comprehensive American response. Iranian proxy networks spanning Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen create multiple simultaneous pressure points requiring American defensive resource allocation across vast geographic areas. Regional refugee implications demonstrate humanitarian crisis potential that European systems cannot absorb while creating political instability across neighboring states that Iranian strategy can exploit for broader regional destabilization. Syrian conflict experience reveals how American military intervention generates multi-generational displacement crises that military victory cannot resolve through political settlement. Congressional opposition demonstrates institutional constraint, attempts that executive war powers traditionally override through constitutional commander-in-chief authorities. But current polarized political environment may generate unprecedented legislative resistance to presidential military action without formal declaration procedures. This constitutional crisis potential adds domestic instability to international warfare risks that compound strategic complexity. Market system vulnerabilities extend beyond energy sector into global supply chain disruption through shipping lane closure and insurance cost escalation that affects commerce far removed from Middle Eastern geography. Financial contagion through currency volatility and commodity price shock creates economic warfare dimension that affects allied relationships through shared economic costs rather than direct military involvement. Intelligence assessment credibility faces systematic questioning following decades of Middle Eastern intervention failures, creating domestic political resistance to military action based on classified intelligence claims that public and congressional skepticism cannot independently verify. This credibility deficit constrains presidential ability to maintain public support for sustained military operations that effective Iranian campaign would require. Allied relationship implications prove decisive for long-term strategic positioning regardless of immediate military outcome success. European capitals increasingly alienated by American unilateral military action may accelerate strategic autonomy development through defense cooperation and diplomatic coordination that excludes American oversight, fundamentally altering transatlantic alliance architecture that American global strategy depends upon. The precedent establishment creates international system instability that extends beyond Iranian nuclear program into broader deterrence architecture, governing regional power relationships globally. When military action becomes standard response to nuclear threshold status, proliferation incentives accelerate rather than diminish as regional powers recognize that nuclear capability provides insufficient protection against determined great power pressure. I conclude that Trump's consideration of Iranian strikes represents systematic collapse of strategic rationality under pressure of domestic political necessity, creating escalation dynamics that American military superiority cannot control once regional warfare begins through Iranian asymmetric retaliation capacity. The strategic overreach demonstrates imperial psychology divorced from operational reality, where tactical military advantages cannot achieve strategic objectives that require political solutions beyond military capability. The Iranian nuclear program provides justification for military action that serves domestic political requirements rather than genuine non-proliferation objectives. As regional proliferation accelerates through demonstrated ineffectiveness of negotiated agreements and international law in constraining great power military action, the precedent destroys deterrence architecture through credibility inflation that makes future diplomatic solutions impossible when military action becomes routine response to strategic disagreement. American hegemonic decline accelerates through imperial overextension that allies cannot support and enemies can exploit, creating multipolar competition advantages for revisionist powers that patient strategic development cannot match. The Iranian crisis becomes catalyst for fundamental international system transformation rather than regional crisis management, with consequences extending decades beyond immediate military action, through institutional breakdown that peaceful resolution cannot restore once warfare momentum achieves critical threshold activation.